For a long time, the story around Windows users has been pretty simple. Windows was the default. You bought a PC, it came with Windows. You learned Windows. You stuck with Windows, even if you complained about updates, bugs, or forced restarts. Most people just shrugged and stayed. Switching felt risky, complicated, or unnecessary. But something interesting has been happening quietly over the last few years, and it's accelerating now. Windows users aren't just complaining anymore, they're leaving. Not in dramatic headline-grabbing waves, but in a slow, steady, almost silent migration. And once you start paying attention, the reasons behind it become impossible to ignore. At first glance, it doesn't look like a revolution. There's no massive announcement, no single update that broke everything overnight. Instead, it's death by 1,000 small frustrations. Each one on its own feels tolerable. Together, they push people to a breaking point, a forced update that reboots at the worst possible time. A feature you didn't ask for, suddenly appearing in your taskbar. A setting you turned off mysteriously turning itself back on. An ad where a system tool used to be. None of these things are catastrophic, but they chip away at trust. Over time, Windows stops feeling like your computer and starts feeling like a service you're borrowing under conditions you didn't agree to. One of the biggest shifts has been control, or more accurately, the loss of it. For years, Windows was marketed as flexible and customizable, but modern Windows increasingly behaves like it knows better than you. Updates are no longer a conversation. They're a command. You can delay them sometimes, but you can't truly say no. Features tied to online accounts become harder to avoid. Local accounts are hidden behind extra steps. Telemetry settings are scattered and vague. Even experienced users sometimes find themselves thinking, "Why is this so hard to turn off?" That question alone is enough to plant a seed of doubt. If this is my computer, why do I have to fight it? Privacy plays a huge role in this quiet switch. Many Windows users never thought of themselves as privacy-focused. They weren't trying to hide anything, but the constant reminders that the operating system is collecting data, syncing behavior, suggesting content, and integrating cloud services by default starts to feel invasive. You don't have to be paranoid to feel uncomfortable when your OS feels more like a data pipeline than a neutral tool. When people discover that alternatives exist where data collection is minimal, transparent, or optional, curiosity turns into experimentation, and experimentation often turns into switching. Then there's performance, especially on older or mid-range hardware. Windows has grown heavy. Each new version brings more background processes, more services, more things running even when you're doing nothing. On a brand new high-end machine, this might not be obvious. On a laptop that's a few years old, it's painfully clear. Boot times creep up, fans spin louder, battery life drops faster. People assume their hardware is dying until they try something else and realize the machine still has plenty of life left. That moment is shocking. When the same laptop suddenly feels fast, quiet, and responsive under a different operating system, it reframes the entire problem. Maybe the hardware wasn't the issue after all. Cost is another factor that doesn't always get talked about openly, but it matters. Windows licenses aren't cheap, even if many users don't pay for them directly. When you build a PC, that license is a noticeable expense. When you reinstall or upgrade, activation issues can be stressful. In contrast, discovering that there are full-featured operating systems available for free, legally, with no activation keys and no expiration, feels almost too good to be true. For students, hobbyists, and people in regions where software costs are a bigger burden, this alone can be enough to justify the switch. Once they realize they're not sacrificing quality, the decision becomes even easier. Another quiet but powerful reason is the changing nature of everyday computing. For many users, the apps that truly matter now live in the browser. Email, documents, messaging, project management, even creative tools increasingly run as web apps. When your workflow revolves around Chrome, Firefox, or another browser, the underlying operating system matters less than it used to. This lowers the psychological barrier to switching. If all your important work opens in a browser tab, why stay locked to one OS? People try an alternative just to see, and then realize nothing breaks. That realization is liberating. Gaming used to be the ultimate reason to stay on Windows, and for a long time, it was a valid one. But that argument is slowly losing its absolute power. Compatibility layers, Improved drivers and support from major platforms have changed the landscape. While not every game runs perfectly everywhere, the gap has narrowed enough that many gamers are willing to compromise, especially if they value stability, performance, or freedom more. Some even report smoother experiences once they switch, particularly on systems where Windows overhead was holding things back. Gaming is no longer the iron chain it once was. Work culture has also shifted. Remote work and hybrid setups mean people are spending more time on their personal machines for professional tasks. When your computer becomes your primary workspace, small annoyances become big problems. A forced update in the middle of a meeting isn't just annoying, it's embarrassing. A system slowed down during a deadline isn't just inconvenient, it's costly. People start valuing reliability and predictability over brand familiarity. They want an environment that stays the way they left it. That doesn't change behavior overnight because a company decided to push a new feature. When they find an OS that respects that expectation, loyalty forms quickly. Another underrated factor is community and learning. Many switchers talk about how refreshing it feels to be part of an ecosystem where solutions are shared openly. Documentation is accessible and customization is encouraged. Instead of waiting for an official patch, users can often fix or tweak things themselves. This doesn't appeal to everyone, but for those who enjoy understanding how their system works, it's empowering. Even people who don't want to tinker benefit indirectly because the ecosystem evolves rapidly and transparently. Bugs are discussed openly, roadmaps are public. That openness builds trust. There's also a growing fatigue with the direction Windows seems to be heading. The operating system increasingly feels like a platform for services rather than a tool. Search results mixed with ads, system notifications, promoting subscriptions, built-in apps that can't be fully removed. AI features integrated whether you want them or not. Some users love these additions, but many don't. The problem isn't that these features exist, it's that opting out is often harder than opting in. When users feel like passengers instead of drivers, they start looking for the exit. What makes this shift particularly interesting is how quiet it is. People aren't announcing it with fanfare. They're not always arguing online. They just install something else, adjust their workflow, and move on. Friends notice months later when they see a different desktop or hear a different startup sound. Coworkers realize it when a screen share looks unfamiliar. By then, the switch is already complete. And when asked if they regret it, many say no. Some say they wish they'd done it sooner. This doesn't mean Windows is disappearing or that everyone is switching. Far from it. Windows still dominates in many areas, and for many users, it works well enough. But dominance isn't the same as loyalty. What's changing is the assumption that Windows is the only sensible choice. That assumption is cracking. Once people realize they have options, the power dynamic shifts. Microsoft is no longer competing against nothing. It's competing against freedom, simplicity, and trust. Another subtle driver is the rise of pre-installed alternatives on new devices. More manufacturers are experimenting with shipping systems that don't rely on Windows, especially in education and emerging markets. Students grow up using these systems and don't see Windows as the default. When they later buy their own machines, they're more open to alternatives. Habits formed early are powerful, and this generational shift could have long-term consequences. Even professionals who still need Windows for specific tasks are changing how they use it. Dual boot setups, virtual machines, and secondary devices allow people to minimize their time in Windows. They keep it for what they must do, but spend the rest of their time elsewhere. This gradual distancing matters. It reduces emotional attachment. When the day comes that they no longer need Windows at all, leaving feels natural rather than scary. There's also an emotional element that's hard to quantify, but easy to feel. Many longtime Windows users describe a sense of relief after switching. Relief that their system isn't constantly nagging them. Relief that updates happen on their terms. Relief that their machine feels like a tool again, not a billboard. That emotional response is powerful. It's not about benchmarks or feature lists. It's about how it feels to sit down and use your computer every day. Critics sometimes dismiss switchers as a vocal minority, but that misses the point. This movement isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and practical. It's driven by everyday users making rational decisions based on their experiences. When enough people quietly choose something else, the impact can be profound, even if it doesn't trend on social media. What makes this moment different from past attempts to lure users away from Windows is maturity. Alternatives are no longer rough experiments. They're polished, stable, and well-supported. Hardware compatibility is better than ever. Installation is simpler. Software availability is broader. The excuses that once justified staying on Windows are losing weight. Each year, switching becomes less of a leap and more of a step. In the end, the most telling sign isn't market share graphs or press releases, it's conversations. It's the way people say, almost casually, "I don't use Windows anymore." No anger, no drama, just a statement of fact. That casual tone is what should really get attention, because revolutions aren't always loud. Sometimes they happen quietly, one user at a time, until one day everyone looks around and realizes the default has changed. Windows users aren't switching because they hate Windows. Most of them don't. They're switching because they've outgrown it, or because it's changed in ways that no longer align with what they want from a computer. They want control. They want transparency. They want performance that respects their hardware. They want an operating system that works for them, not the other way around. And once they find that, they rarely look back. That's why this shift matters. Not because Windows is suddenly bad, but because users are more aware, more informed, and more willing to choose. The quiet switching isn't about rebellion, it's about choice. And in a world where choice used to feel impossible, that alone is a powerful reason why it's happening now.